Hey gang, I'm Nikki LaCroce, and you're listening to Who the Fuck. And today I'm sharing the mic with Joe Reichert, and Joe's an award-winning leader who holds the belief that when people succeed, their teams can succeed. And so Joe's professional experience coupled with his emotional intelligence prompted him to design a leadership development program that highlights the fact that management and leadership are two fundamentally different things. This is a topic that's incredibly important to me since I've spent many years in toxic work environments, and I'm a firm believer in Joe's mission to shift the leadership paradigm and the ability to build sustainable teams when people actually feel seen, heard, and valued. So welcome to the show, Joe.
Oh, thank you, Nikki. I'm happy to be here. And sadly, too many of us have had those toxic environments. So anything we can do to squash them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is it takes, a few dominoes to fall, but then you get a really good amount of momentum. And I do feel like we're at a point in time where that shift is happening for a lot of reasons. So I feel really compelled to have this conversation to open people's minds to the way that we're moving forward when we think about life and work. And I actually, just before hopping on, had been scrolling through TikTok a little bit, and I saw this message that this woman had posted about the future of work and how we need to stop asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because the way work is going to be, the way it already is starting to be, is that we're trying to decouple our identities from just the role that we do. And I felt like, gosh, that's so serendipitous that I would see that today, particularly when the nature of some of the things that you've discussed are about, being a leader isn't necessarily something that is assigned to you because you have a role. It's something that's earned. And so I thought we could jump into the conversation with a little bit about how you got into the role that you're in now, and then we can get deeper into the sort of philosophical side of it and why it's really important.
Yeah. I think like most people, sadly, the story starts out as a bummer. You go through an environment that kind of sucks. And then you go, gosh, how can we make it even a smidge better? And
Yep.
I think what really flicked the light on for me was at work when we were trying to design a leadership program, and I thought of the best leaders I'd ever had, and I went, well, how do you teach that? Because what's in our program right now is definitely not leading someone to being all those qualities that I really looked up to in someone. And then I went, oh my God, maybe there's a bigger disconnect than that. And so I just sat down for a long time and I started thinking, well, how do you actually become that type of person? And then how would you describe it to someone else succinctly, simply, and make it repeatable? And that's eventually how I came up with, well, I don't think being a leader is actually anything that's tied to what I call your functional duty, or really your job title. Because I've had terrible bosses, like people that I loathed them, and I know they did not care for me as a person.
Yeah, I can share that sentiment.
Yeah. And I was like, you're definitely not a good leader or a leader at all, but yet you have this title that people associate with one, which I think is the very first disconnect. It's like when Neo, right, takes the pill from Morpheus and he's like, we're going into like a whole different area. And what I tell people is whenever we start talking about leadership, it's going to be really painful at first because there's a whole bunch of preconceived notions and synonyms that we've built up that really make it difficult. So then you start saying, well, I have a bad leader. Well, I would argue, I don't think you have a leader. I think you just have a crappy manager who treats people really poorly.
Yeah, that's such a good explanation of it and really simplifies it too, because there have been many times that I've had conversations with people where I'm like, I'll say something along the lines of leadership. And I'm like, actually, you know what? That's not really fair to call them that because they're not leaders. At best, they're managers and they're maybe not even doing that well. So, it really goes to show how we sort of have been conditioned to accept what leadership is, and that we have been bred to believe that it is okay for it to be subpar, because the way the hierarchy works is that if this is the person who is in this higher ranking role, then they are the leader. And therefore, because they're the leader, you must follow. But something that you brought up in your TED Talk that I absolutely loved, and this is how you got to that, like really the simplicity of it, I don't want to give away your actual.
Oh, keep going. I love it. Keep
should I
going.
say? So is the idea that a leader is somebody who has a follower, and why do we follow people? And you got to the root of the psychological side of it, right? The ability for people to actually connect on a human level is what allows us to trust somebody and entrust them with that position of being a leader. So at what point did you actually get to that moment of clarity where you were like, it really is this simple. We just have to feel like we're connected to this person with enough trust that we would want to follow them?
Oh yeah. I was on my balcony and it was overlooking a beautiful parking lot in southern Denver. I remember, I had been literally staring at pieces of paper just blankly, and I was trying to. And what happened was, I had asked someone, and I didn't really even understand the grenade I was handing them when I asked them, so you just finished this leadership development program, and at our company it's 3 years long. And I said to this person, I said, that's amazing. How have your views changed? What is leadership now to you? And it was like their brain just imploded from the inside out. And I was like, oh, wow, this is much more difficult than I thought it would be. And so I started asking other people. And then eventually I just went, well, I should ask myself what it is. And I had no answer. And usually people will give you like a really long, thought out, normally pretty good description of what leadership is. But I was like, gosh, it's so complicated. It's so hard to replicate that. Like, how would you, like, if someone said woodworking is like really complex, you'd be like, well, I'm probably not going to do that. It seems too hard. So I was sitting there with a piece of paper, and I just thought, and my background is in math. So my undergrad is in math. And so I thought, well, let's nerd it out for a minute. Maybe an equation would be simpler than trying to write it down on words. And so I just started drawing like, well, if you're following someone, what does it look like? And I just drew like a square with an arrow going towards a circle. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's literally all it is here. That's literally, I think, all it is.
I love it.
It's just someone following someone else. And once I had that thought, I was like, oh, if you could just describe what makes someone want to do that, I think you could replicate what all those people were doing in my life who were great leaders. Because the one thing they all had in common was, I know they cared about me.
Yeah.
Like, as a person, they definitely cared. And that's kind of where I started. And then I just, I followed the wormhole a little bit, but it was that moment where I was like, oh, it's just following other people is what makes you a leader. And then it kind of just opened up the door for other ways to simplify it.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's the real beauty in the way that our brains can work so differently from one another. I am not a math person, and I really respect people who can kind of see the strategic angles differently because of that. And I think that that's also what makes for really balanced teams. That's a little bit of an aside, but in general, I feel like good leadership also promotes diversity of thought and ways of working together that are not necessarily structured so much that you don't have the freedom to problem solve creatively. And I think a lot of times that's where bad managers and non-leaders make mistakes, is that they're oftentimes, let's be honest, yes people who are just trying to climb the ladder. And so they're also those people that tend to empire build. So the people that they're cultivating as their proteges are people that they see, that they want to take along for the ride with them, not necessarily thinking these are the things that I need to do to help them improve as a human being or as an employee or professionally in whatever regard, but because this is part of my crew, I'm going to take them with me. And what you point out too is this idea that when somebody cares about you, you have a much different emotional investment than you do if you feel like somebody is ignoring you, doesn't respect you. I mean, professionally, I'm a woman in tech. I have done this for 15, 16 years now. And there have been a lot of times where I'm getting talked down to either because of my age or my gender. Or at Amazon, a really great example is just hierarchy. They legitimately level you as like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it's like, or there's no 9, but there's a 10. It's weird. I don't know. But it's like these ideas are really built, I think they're ingrained in our minds as a way to show if we've succeeded or not, as opposed to a way to exhibit growth, which I think is kind of the way that you've established the importance of decoupling
Yeah.
management and leadership. Because one is a skill based, like a hard skill based functionality, those job duties, and the other is soft skills, compassion, vulnerability, understanding, a list of other things.
Yeah. And I think you highlighted the key there. And I think the prerequisite to simplifying it down is separating functions from roles on teams. And so if you've ever, like you mentioned, at Amazon or any other corporate, like large corporation, you go into a meeting and when you log in, it says your title above your name. Like everybody knows this is who you are, this is your level, this is what you do. And you have a set of very specific duties that are associated with that title. But how you go about achieving those, I'll call them job requirements, and the manner in which you behave while acting as your function, that's what other people see you as. And then that's how you earn a role. So that's, to me, the difference between functions and roles. And being a leader is something that you earn and it's a role. So it's completely independent from your function. And the key here is that I believe anybody, no matter what their level is, can earn that role based on how you behave, because it doesn't matter to me as a human whether Nikki's a level 1 or a level, 10, whatever engineer. If my needs are being met by continuing to follow you and going along with your guidance, then I'll just continue to do it. And I think biologically as humans, we don't really, we're not really making that choice like, oh, yes, I'm going to follow this person. It's advantageous. It's like, no, you just kind of do it. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really matter who the person is. So I think going back to the hierarchy in companies, I think we've really ingrained in people that once you hit a certain level, this is when you become a leader, or this is when you become important, or this is when we want to hear from you. And it's like, no, that system of, it's all tied to your years of experience and how much money you get paid is so ass backwards. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's funny. It makes me think about something my mom used to say when we were younger. If something happened that we didn't like, she would jokingly say RHIP, which is rank has its privilege. And I'm like, that's what being in corporate America is like. Rank is what matters. And what I think is really interesting about that idea too, Joe, is the fact that you can really be, what you pointed out is you can really be a leader in any type of role. And the fact that we sort of designate that as this achievement for people who maybe didn't earn that respect. It's sort of this implied respect because of the level that you are or the title that you have. But is it actual respect? And I think about this in terms of politics too. And I'm going to be very mindful of not going too far down that rabbit hole, but I think it applies a lot, globally speaking, around political hierarchies, because there are these people who are so desperate for power and they're not respected. So they have to command power because people wouldn't follow them unless they were forced to. And it's like leadership in business can absolutely be that way. People leverage power to condition people to do what they want. And when you have somebody who's operating that way, they're, in my opinion, by definition, not a leader. It's more of a dictator. And I also think that the thing that is really important to acknowledge with that as well is if somebody is actively seeking power, you're also not a leader. To have power is a privilege. It's something, as you said, you earn power. But if your entire mission is to just acquire it, I'm questioning every motive you have.
Absolutely. And I think you're highlighting what I would define as the difference between power and influence, because I think power is associated with your title. And so I think there's on every team, there's a certain amount of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at work, it's definitely not evenly distributed. I call them non-uniform power teams because the CEO has the largest pizza slice, and then the other C-suite people, and then you've got vice presidents and other executives, and then you go down to managers, and then through all the levels, like you just said, and all those people have an amount of power that's tied to their title, but everybody in there has different amounts of influence, and influence is something you gain from other people, and it's completely separate from power. And we can skip the interplay between the two, but I think what you're talking about with politics and people trying to gain power, I call it weaponizing leadership, because
Yeah.
really what they're doing, and if you look at people who've done this in the past, and we'll go back a ways, I mean, Hitler was one of the best people to ever do this because he put so much fear into people that he really made them question their basic safety. And so they felt like they had no other choice than to ascend him into a position of power.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think people choose to follow someone because they get their basic needs met, and then they get their, wants and whatever else they want satisfied. But if you tell someone your life is in danger unless you hate the same people as me, unless you agree with me on all of these really disgusting and evil premises, then you and your family will not be safe. So then they vote these people into positions of power, and then you can't remove them because
Right.
now they have, instead of just having influence, they have actual power over you because you've put them in a place where they can make decisions and they don't really need you anymore. And
They
so I think
leverage. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh no, I just think it's a really scary thing, and we see it constantly, and we're about to go into an election cycle, and if you ever see a negative ad, that's exactly what you're being exposed to, is someone basically doing like Leonardo DiCaprio Inception on you and going, hey, you're actually not that safe, but I have a solution, and if you just dislike the same people I dislike, here we go. I mean, all you have to do is just give me a little bit of power and we'll make it better. And that's exactly what's happening.
You're 100% right. And it's scary. Absolutely. Years ago, after visiting Dachau in Munich and seeing what a concentration camp was like, I became very invested in learning more about World War II and trying to understand how it came to that, because you drive through this like suburban German neighborhood and it's right there. And you're like, how could this happen? How could it be so seen but untouched? And to then witness what is, I mean, the state of the US right now is just really horrifying, to say the least. And the thing that gives me hope are people like yourself, the other people I talk to on this podcast, because there's an understanding that we are better together and that the collective effort of people who have others' best interest in mind is more powerful and influential ultimately than these people who are just like, grabbing at straws, trying to like accumulate as much power as they can with as little effort as possible, by the way, because it always fascinates me. The people who try so hard are the people who are like the shittiest people. And it's like, if you put that energy towards good things, not only would people actually like and respect you, which is what your inner child is desperately craving, but that you would also actually get things done. And it's really fascinating to me to kind of witness that inner struggle with people who are so power hungry that they have almost no awareness of why they're so desperate. And it makes it very hard, rather impossible, to be a good leader when you can't even regulate yourself. So like, how do you show up for other people in a way that helps them feel safe, that helps them feel seen, that helps them feel cared for, if you have no idea how to do that in your own day-to-day life? I mean, the fact that you led the conversation with the biggest thing that these people who are leaders, who I consider leaders, have in common is that they showed that they cared about me. And it's like, that also breeds like a mutual caring back, because you can feel that. That's an energetic exchange between people who have each other's best interest in mind as best you can. And, listen, we're always going to have to look out for number one first. I learned that in business, just like through my own experiences. You might think that you are on the same page with somebody who's like your number one person, your buddy, whoever, and it doesn't always net out. If you have to choose you or them, a lot of times that is that whole survival mentality where we're going to choose ourselves. Like you said, if we feel unsafe, we'll do the thing that makes us feel safe. But to that, I would say, why can't we all feel safe?
Yeah. And I mean, that's a great point. And I think, the fact that, okay, so I don't think just leaders should understand what leadership is because, as you said, when good leaders make you feel good, but toxic people really perpetuate that toxic environment, which I think is where we're at right now in the United States. No matter where you are on what side of the aisle, it's very venomous towards the other side, right? Like there's no middle ground. There's no, let's just have a conversation. It's like, no, you're wrong. I hate you. I hate everything you stand for.
It's petty. Get out of the way. And it feels like we're getting nothing done.
And I would agree. And I think the issue is, and here's the thing. I think people in general, though, need to take a little more responsibility and understand when they're being manipulated, because people who are really good at people who understand, even if they don't realize what they're doing, the psychological aspect of manipulating someone's safety or their well-being and framing it in a way that unless I'm chosen as this group's, dictator, president, whatever you want to call it, then you're not okay. But we as the public need to understand when it's happening. I think I don't know if it's due to social media or what, but we're just blissfully unaware of when we're being like, the puppet masters are pulling on the strings and they're like, oh, these people said this and this and this. And it's like, well, we need to step back and go like, why, for what is this true? Because otherwise we're just destined to just keep repeating the past. And it might not look like it did in the 1940s, but I'm fearful it could look similar at some point in the future if somebody really understood how to do it well, because we're so quick to jump, especially right now, we're so quick to jump on that message of they're wrong and we should remove those people instead of just let's have a conversation and let's see, let's let the chips fall where they may.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good point. And I have a lot of feelings about that because I think everybody that we're dealing with in that power dynamic, for the most part, politically speaking, I won't say everybody, a majority of the people are not only power hungry, but they're greedy in terms of financial means. And I think when it comes to stuff like that, and we consider the work that you're doing from a leadership perspective, not only does it make it difficult to have a living wage, to, get your basic needs met, but some of these companies and perceived leaders are holding hostage their employees' well-being. The fact that these people who are higher ups in companies lack the empathy and the self-awareness to be able to grasp how somebody making $7.25 an hour can't feed themselves, let alone a family, or pay rent, or do any of those things. It foundationally shakes things because there's no way to fix that without starting at the top, because those are the people who, well, let me put it this way. That was probably not the correct way to say it. We have to fix it at like the level of the people who are the boots on the ground, the people who are actually experiencing it, right? We can advocate for ourselves as much as humanly possible, but you need to be able to influence those people who are craving power. And it's hard to figure out the way to speak to those people if they don't see what they're doing as fundamentally wrong. So like in the work that you're doing, how do you go about approaching conversations with companies or leaders that are maybe averse to the ideas that you're bringing to them?
Ooh, when they're averse to it. Yeah, there's really only one prerequisite to being a good leader, and it's caring about other people. And I always say that's the one thing I can't help someone with. If you don't care about other people, I'm so sorry. If you read all the books on earth, you could listen to every TED talk, but if you don't care about other people, it just won't work. And so I'm very honest. And I'm also um, not the most popular person at work because I think people can change a little, but like 10 to 15%. So I don't think you can make a wholesale change if you just are completely just a sucky person. And so what I tell the people who work for them, just leave. I tell them, leave. Honestly, you know, because usually I'm talking to them as a manager on another team in that company. I go, hey, we'd love to keep you, right? But I'm not really like a spokesperson for the company, and I don't take responsibility for that person's actions. And I care about you more than this company does. And I'm telling you right now, if you have someone who's toxic to you, you should just go, because I could sit down with a really bad leader for a long time and discuss like the data. Like there's actual data as to teams succeeding and producing more discretionary effort if you have a good leader. But honestly, if that's your rationale, you'll probably just revert back to being crappy anyways. So I guess to answer your question, there's little to no hope if you're past like, you can be indifferent. I can help someone who's indifferent usually, but if you're a jerk, there's really not much saving you.
I appreciate the honest answer. And I would agree with you wholeheartedly in my experience, because there are the people who are really just in it for themselves. And that's exactly what you described. And it makes me wonder, because I can't remember the statistic. I feel like it's like 70% or something. 70% of people leave their managers, not a company. Like they're not quitting their job, they're quitting their manager basically.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I think about any time that I've quit. And if it wasn't my direct manager, it was like my skip level manager. So their boss. But somebody who influenced my day-to-day life in a way that I didn't like and didn't want to continue to suffer. And I think that the other thing that is frustrating when you're dealing with people who aren't open to adapting the way that they run their teams or their businesses is that you are going to still be held to a standard that they have. And so you're in this constant state of misalignment, which means that no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you press yourself to deliver, there will always be some gap between what they want and what you can give, or what they want and what you need. And so it is really important to be discerning about why you're staying somewhere. I've stayed at jobs because I've needed the money and I've been treated like shit. I've stayed at jobs that I thought were decent and then realized I didn't like it. And I was like, I need to leave. But I always got to this place of burnout because my misery overcame me in an environment where I felt like nobody was invested in my ability to do my job, my well-being at the company, my overall well-being as a human being. And it's not to say that you have to care about every single one of us, like we're this delicate little snowflake, the term everybody loves to use. But I think that on an extremely human level, as you have pointed out, that is like a bare minimum requirement. I left my job at Amazon the same time that I was leaving an abusive relationship. And I have referenced multiple times how similar those experiences are, because you leave and you start to kind of question fucking everything about your life. You're like, why did I put up with it for so long? Why did I accept that? What did I get from it? And so you're negotiating with yourself constantly when you're in a position where you don't feel like you have the respect of the people who are in your business.
Oh, absolutely. And I think so many companies let it fester, and it's almost like, hey, as an organization, we kind of condone this. Like we might do an ethics investigation, but nothing's going to happen to that person. So just so you're aware, this is actually okay how you're being treated right now. And it's, I mean, essentially it's like gaslighting an entire company that like, hey, this is okay. And it's like, are you sure? Is anyone else feeling the way I'm feeling right now? Because it really feels messed up. And when nothing happens to that person, I think it's one of the worst things for a company, because HR will just go to them and say, hey, we'd really like you to be better. We've received some complaints, this and that. Can you just tighten it up a little bit? And then they're like, yeah, okay. And then a week later, it's like exactly where we were. So,
and then they get promoted. Let's be honest.
they get promoted. And I've been a part of companies where they're like, you know what, this person's actually so bad, we're just going to put them into another area,
Yes.
and that job
Yes.
has a promotion. So yeah, okay.
Yeah, I've witnessed that as well. And not only is that absurd for obvious reasons, but it's also devaluing the work that people who are actually doing their jobs and doing them well and who do have leadership qualities aren't getting, because they're shifting around the shitty people and they're like kind of like pushing the peas around the plate to make it look okay. And instead of actually really investing in the people who are truly doing the work, who are delivering the work product, whatever that is, whether it's making a product, whether it's selling that product, marketing it, whether it's a service as a product, right? It doesn't matter. The entire ability for a company, large or small, to function is rooted in people truly doing the work, not people who are shuffling things around, trying to look busy, and then condemning people for not meeting their unrealistic standards. I mean, you and I both work in tech. Your job is very different than mine as an aerospace engineer, but as a product manager, it's like the company that I am contracting with right now is the first company in my entire career that I've ever worked at where I feel like I have emotional and psychological safety, and I feel like I have some autonomy and respect for what I'm capable of doing. That's not to say I didn't have bits and pieces of that in other roles with other teams or leaders, and I've always worked with people that I like. But the entire experience has shifted my perspective on the way a business should be run, because this company respects people at its core.
And it really takes being at a bad place and then a good place to understand what's right. And I see so many young employees, people who are fresh out of school, and they don't understand whether or not how their manager is treating them is correct or okay. And it's really hard. And I'm not advocating just a mass exodus from every job ever, although it's close.
Not overtly.
Not over. I would not on wax say that everyone should leave right now, but I would say that, you really have to, I mean, with experience, you come to find, oh, this is what I really value in a manager or a manager's manager. And understanding the environment that's fostered in those good work environments versus the bad ones, it really is, unfortunately, something you have to almost go through, because you could tell somebody, hey, here are the lessons I've learned, X, Y, and Z, but unless you have the scars, unfortunately, it's really hard to understand. It's hard to find your true value, because if you don't understand how you should be treated, it's hard for you to have a barometer or something to compare against. And I think a lot of employees at any job, but especially the ones who are levels 1, 2, and 3, they just don't understand that. And they'll put up with way more than someone who's experienced and, like you or I, understands, hey, this is not okay. Or, oh, this is great. I love how I'm being treated here.
I really love all of those points that you made. I agree with you wholeheartedly on the idea that we have to go through some of that to understand what it is that we want, need, and value, and what makes us feel valued. I think that that's the case for any relationship that we have. I mean, I made the comparison to leaving Amazon and this last relationship, and I'd gone to another job after Amazon that was also toxic and stressful. And I then at the same time had met my now wife, and I'm like, this is what good looks like now that I've got this. And then she encouraged me to take care of myself, and I left this other job and decided to do contract work so I could go more all in on the podcast. And I ended up at this company, honestly, because the leader, the true leader that I have right now, this guy, Ken, he pursued me after I said I don't want to continue with the interview process because I don't think I'm going to stay in tech. And something stood out to him about me, and he wanted me to continue the process if I was open to it. They negotiated with me to be able to work as a contractor instead of full time. That gives everybody mutual benefits, but it also was the persistence to attract talent that was not aggressive. It was meaningful.
Genuine.
I've never had somebody pursue me with meaning.
Oh, yeah. And I think there's the reciprocal of that too. So there's, leader to employee and employee to leader. So I've had folks on my team And then I've left that job and I loved working with him so much. I said, hey, what would it take to hire you again? You're awesome. Right. And then
Yeah.
I've also had bosses who left and I was like, I think I'm going to go see if they have open positions because I really like how that person ran the team. And so you don't really realize it so much, especially now with how often people switch jobs and, there's so many opportunities and there's so many, open positions and places to grow these days. But when you find a leader that you really care for and who cares about you, I've noticed you'll see like groups of people leave one area and then they'll go to the next area. And then if that leader leaves, another group goes with them to somewhere else. And it's probably one of the greatest forms of flattery for a leader you could ever have. Because if people enjoy following you, and they make it clearly known that you're doing a good job at it, I mean, that's proof in the pudding. Absolutely.
I think it's great that you just made that point because it did make me think about the manager that I had at Amazon right before I left, the director of the team that I was on. I was one of her first hires on her team, and she had accumulated a following of people from other businesses that she's been at and other relationships she had. And she built up this really fantastic team, and it was a super high performing team. I think at the end of the day, everybody was needing different things by the time we were all kind of said and done with it. But the moment that I 100% solidified that I was leaving was the day I found out that she was leaving. And
absolutely.
Then she went to this other company and a handful of people went with her, right? And it's because you have that sense of trust. And I think sometimes, as we're saying all of this, it is important to make the distinction of a good leader in a bad company or a bad situation, like professionally speaking, because I wouldn't discredit her at all. I think she did what needed to be done. And I also think you have to play the game. And sometimes the game is bullshit. The game's rigged. So you're not going to win.
And that is well said, because you mentioned earlier, there's a very common saying, people don't leave jobs, they leave bad leaders. And then there's another one that I hear a lot, which is there are no bad teams, only bad leaders. And I think I love those sayings because I'm all about making things simple, but I think there's a bit of blurring the lines in there when it comes to that person's function as like a coach or a manager and then their role on the team. So I think you can actually leave a job if your boss is incompetent and they're a great leader, which is oddly possible. So you can be very bad at setting a schedule, defining deliverables, X, Y, and Z, but you can do all of those soft skill things, we'll call them, that make someone really understand you care about them, that you're going to help them in any way that you can, you're going to serve them. And so that right there is a scenario where you can have a good leader, but still a bad boss and want to leave a job. So I've had people, myself included, where I've had a boss that I went, this person I think is a good leader deep down, and I know they care about me, and I enjoy working with them, but their abilities in their function are so bad that it makes it hard to stay here and work. And that's why those two sayings to me are a little oversimplified, because you can't forget there's both pieces, right? If you're in a position of functional authority, like a manager or a director, you have your role on the team and your function. And if you're not good at both of them, you will probably see people leave. If you're not good at being a leader, you'll probably be known as like an ass or a jerk. If you're not good at your function, you'll probably just be called like inept. Mm-hmm. So, you have to be both. And I think people will leave for either of those reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the way that you rounded that out. It makes a lot of sense. And I think the scenario that strikes me when I consider that team that I was on is very competent leader, very good leader, very capable, but the way the overarching structure of the company is, the rigidity of being at an organization that is as large as Amazon makes it very hard to change things in a way that is focused on what a team truly needs beyond what
Preach.
that manager specifically can control. And
Oh my
so
gosh.
you get to a point where it's like, I mean, here's a great example. I left that relationship and there was an act of domestic violence. So like my boss knew that I was dealing with chaos, and then my mom passed away unexpectedly. So I went on leave for 3 weeks. And first of all, I think just in general, the fact that Amazon's bereavement policy is 3 days and you're like, you can't even get a week, really? Okay.
Wow.
But it's like that shows me that you don't really care, first of all. But
Okay.
it was, I came back from this time off, and right before I left, we had launched something. And so I felt like, okay, it's fine, whatever. And I came back and I was almost immediately told that I was under scrutiny for not performing. And I was like,
Wow.
I feel like I knew that wasn't my, I felt like I knew that wasn't coming from my leadership in the way that it was actually messaged to me, because I know that the guy that I was working for, who reported up to the other leader that I was just speaking about, like, they've shown compassion and understanding to me, right? But the way that business works is that, like, if you're not showing value, out you go. Not our problem, you know? And I think to not be flexible in very extenuating circumstances, when people are experiencing a lot, in general, it could be anything, but like those are two super deeply traumatic events that were rapid fire, like in the same time span as each other. And as soon as I had the ability to leave, I knew that I needed to, because I felt so disconnected from my ability to do any work after that, feeling like I wasn't valued before. I'm definitely not valued now. And that doesn't even have anything to do with my work product anymore. This is solely on, as a human being, I feel like you are completely overlooking the impact that something like this can have on somebody. And if you, I'm not saying, you know, you hold somebody's hand, you have millions of employees, like you can't do that with everybody, but be compassionate and lead from a place that is focused on the humanity of things. And I struggle with big companies that get to be as large as they are and sort of have this idealized view of like what it must be like. Oh, you work at these big companies. Oh my gosh. Like everybody's got their bad reviews. People know that. But when you feel like your integrity is compromised, or your ability to have the emotional safety that you need, it is a form of psychological abuse. And I think that it doesn't get said. And I am, as the words are coming out of my mouth, I'm like, people are going to be like, this is bullshit. Millennials, do you think everything's abuse? I mean, a little bit. That's like why everybody's so pissed that people are Gen Z and millennials. They don't want to work. And it's like, no, we don't want to work for shitty people.
Well, that should be on a t-shirt. Yeah. We don't want to work for shitty people. And yes. And the thing that gets overlooked, especially when, as you mentioned, that rhetoric of, oh, you're soft because I'm a millennial. Oh, you're soft. You guys just want, the easy way. You want things handed to you. It's like have you ever met a bad person in real life? Well, those people also work real jobs. And if you work for one of those people who really sucks in real life, then it might really stink when you go to work every day for 40 plus hours, because big companies are putting in more than 40. And so if for 40 hours a week, you're being degraded, demeaning rhetoric, just treated like trash. I mean,
forced to question your own abilities. Like you said, the collective gaslighting that occurs is phenomenal.
Oh yeah. And unfortunately, I think it has to do with results. And this is, to me, the biggest disconnect between, leadership and management, and especially for new leaders. It's when the bullets start flying, right? Everybody can be a great leader when it's easy, when the times are good, when we're hitting quotas, when everybody's producing. But most of life is not like that. Most of the time in your job, it's not going to be smooth. You're going to be under tight deadlines. You might be a little bit behind. That, to me, is the true test of whether or not someone's a good leader. Is how do you treat people when you are feeling a little bit of pressure, when it's not going right, do you throw all of those other things out the window, treating people correctly, putting their needs, like being away for 3 weeks? Okay, well, we might have had a deadline and we could have used Nikki, but yeah, she has her own life and some very important things she needs to attend to. How do you handle that, or that conversation, to me, is like the quickest way to find out if somebody's a good leader or not?
Yeah. Wow. That really just, that rocks. I think that's just such a great way of explaining that, because I think about this manager that I have now who's a VP at the company. And one of the things that I really admire about him is he's accountable, first of all. So if there's a problem, like, he will acknowledge it and he will say, like, this is what I could have done better. It's sort of the idea of, like, I grew up with my parents not saying sorry a lot. And it's like, I see my sister apologize to her kids more. And I think that that's a little bit of that sort of generational mentality where it's like, I can be accountable for things that I might have done that would have impacted this result. So let me say that. Also, when you're getting feedback, it's being given in a way that is, again, empathetic. And I feel like people see empathy sometimes as overly sensitive or too mindful of people. But in reality, the definition of empathy, right, is that you can imagine putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. What does it feel like to be them? How do you want to be spoken to? How can you best receive feedback? Now, where it gets a little more complicated is that not all of us like to be spoken to the same way. Not all of us receive feedback the same way. We all have different things that we hold in, and shame that we feel, and things that we have to work through to even be able to navigate that. So you have to know yourself well enough as a human being to be able to understand what it is that you need. As a leader, you need to be able to understand, ask people those questions so they can communicate that to you if they don't totally know how to approach it. And I think at the end of the day, it's about having a mutual respect and a level of transparency where you have to put your ego aside to be able to have these really honest conversations. Because even just in these past few weeks, when you were talking about the deadlines, I had this moment last week where I was putting some pressure on my engineering team because I thought something seemed like a higher priority. And then after talking to my boss, it was like, no, like, here's how we could have, like, here's how you might have handled it differently. Or actually, he asked me, how might you have handled that differently if this was the desired result? And we ended up talking about it. And it's like, I understand where you're coming from. Thank you for that feedback. Thank you for understanding that that's a good way to approach it with me, because I am a really empathetic person. And I think what you said earlier about, having that trust in people and having the ability to know that you're doing something for somebody who, maybe they don't necessarily have all the technical skills that they need, but they're good at the softer skills. I am confident that I am better with my soft skills than I am with my hard skills, because I care about people to, like, an extensive degree. And so I lead with that. That can also be detrimental in the sense of, like, not having enough focus on some of the more tactical things that have to happen. But it's something that, to me, that's easier to learn than how to, like, care about people.
Yes. And you're highlighting the new leader dilemma, which I see so many people fail. It doesn't sound like you failed at it, but especially when you're brand new to being in a classically defined leadership role, I'll say, like, you have functional authority now, like your first manager job, and you're really posed with this dilemma that we've been talking about, which is, I understand the soft skills that make someone want to follow me, right? But I also recognize, and this would be a pretty aware first-time manager, but I also recognize the functional requirements of my job, and I have to make sure the team is performing, and I have to hold people accountable. And what happens is, if you haven't done it much, you think you have to choose one or the other. And so you think, I either have to go left and be, this people pleaser, so everyone will like me, and you end up kind of leading by consensus. You kind of, you really don't want to stir the pot. You want to make sure, and people like you and I who are highly empathetic, I think normally veer this way, because we really don't want to put someone in a bad position, or
Right.
like make them tense up, like, hey, where's that thing that was due, right? And And then you have people who take like a hard right and they go to like the hard ass, right? And it's like every decision is like a band-aid to be ripped off. Demeaning and empowering can get me the same thing. So whatever's, most time efficient, I'll just do. And I think people who are new to positions of functional authority really struggle with that. In the beginning, you don't understand the nuance. You don't really recognize I can do both. I can be I can hold someone accountable, but I can also be uplifting, and I can make sure they recognize that even if their performance isn't that good. Like last year, I had to have an end of year review of someone where they just didn't have that good of a year. And we had conversations throughout, the months leading up to it about, hey, we need more out of you, this, that, and the other. And how I went into that conversation, I think would define me as a leader, or they would definitely define me as a leader, because you could either go, hey, it's not working, get back to me when you're better and not as terrible at your job. Or it can be something like, hey, let's identify ways to help you. Like, what do you actually want? Do we have you in a role that isn't conducive to your skills? And so how you handle those scenarios, to me, really defines someone, if they're a good leader or not. And then the team, like the other part of it is we're talking about, organizations, people talk, right? And if you're not doing it with one person, it's going to bleed over into other things, and you will have, it won't be good. That's all I'll say. So the interactions, especially for new leaders, are so hard to traverse because you're just not, your communication skills, honestly, aren't that good. You don't understand the people who report to you usually well enough either. And that's another thing that I wrote down as you were speaking earlier, is that whenever I talk to new leaders, I'm very clear with them. It's a lot of work. Just so you know, this is not a glamorous thing. I don't go home every day and go, oh, yes, everything went perfect. I have no stress. It's like, no, I usually want to make sure I'm doing right by people. And so I feel tremendous amounts of pressure to make sure that I, especially at like the end of the year, that they're getting their like due diligence from the company, and I'm fighting for people. And it's a lot of work, and everybody's different. And so that's the thing that I always stress is, hey, if you want to go into a career of leadership, that's great. And I commend anyone who wants to do it, but there are much easier jobs out there.
Right. Well, I think that goes hand in hand with what you had said, where anybody can be a leader, but does everybody want to be? And that was one of the things that when I was at Amazon, I came in at what they referred to as an L6, so a middle manager, product manager. And I didn't have any direct reports. I was an independent contributor. So I ended up kind of getting handed some reports in between other managers moving around and reorgs, et cetera. It was extremely challenging. I was working with somebody who was rather difficult and who had known issues with other people as well. And it was just chaos for a little bit. But what I feel was so important to acknowledge in those moments too, is that I spent a lot of my career in smaller companies cutting my teeth as I was going. And when you go into a larger company like that, there are built-in expectations with how you deal with those situations. And there's methods that people use and the politicking that happens, and I wasn't prepared for that. And that in and of itself was a learning curve for me, because I used to have direct access to CEOs. I was in board meetings. It's a very different environment when there is sort of a preconceived way that things are and that you're walking into that versus being on a team where you're helping define that. And I think particularly when it comes to having a specific style of leading, that the lines get really blurred when you're at companies like that, because I believe probably there are people that have started off at larger organizations and gone in with the best of intentions, and they have been good leaders historically, but we can crack under the pressure. And I know that part of the reason I needed the feedback from my manager this past week was because I could feel my own manic energy projecting onto the people I needed to do the things. And I was like, I don't like how that feels, knowing that I'm stressing people out. And something that I wanted to also mention that I'm kind of circling back to was you had made the comment too about being like a little more forgiving with people who might not have all of the skills, but they have the compassion and the awareness and the desire to help. And my sister and I had this conversation a few years ago, and we were kind of joking, but I think it's also a fair point, is that likability helps a lot professionally. And that's not to say you go in needing people to like you, right? But if you are an inherently likable person and you can make friends or coworkers that you are friendly with, you have influence, like you said. And so I'm not seeking power, but I want people to feel comfortable coming to me. I want them to know that I'm here to help. And that way, we're all getting what we need. And also, the added benefit that is really, I'm going to call it like a fringe benefit, because those are the things that really matter, is if I fuck up or I make a bad decision, people are more forgiving of that because they know that you are doing things for the right reasons. It could have been an oversight. It could have been a lack of communication. It could have been any myriad of things. But we are humans and we are fallible, and it is okay to fuck up sometimes. But if you carry that weight with you all the time, as you said, as a manager in particular, it's somebody who's leading groups of people, you have to be able to let that stuff roll off your back, or you will just drown yourself in like the stress of everybody else's concerns. And you can't function like that either.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. There was a gentleman that I worked with who I was kind of mentoring. He wanted to eventually become a manager. And he asked me, how do you deal with the pressure of the job, like when deadlines are tight and this and that? And I told him, and I ended up telling the team, I just said, care less. I mean, just, do you think our company goes home and thinks about you? No. So when you go home, I know it's very hard and it's trivial to just say, oh, just, let it go. But as best you can, recognize, like, keep pulling yourself out, keep understanding that this is, say we're making a product, to what means, right? To generate revenue for shareholders. That's great. But, should you devote your entire life, right? Would the company feel the same way about you as you feel about them? Probably not, honestly. And I think the key is, if you can find a job where you feel like it's back and forth, like the company or whoever speaks on behalf of the company cares about me as much as I care about them, I think that's probably as good as you can ever ask for, because usually it is, you care about that company way more than they care about you as a person. And it's an unfortunate reality, but when that happens, you have to really step back and go, why do I care so much about this thing? And for some people, it's their life's work and it's a field that they love, and that's great. But, is it worth missing a birthday over? Is it worth missing, part of your vacation for? Mm-hmm. To me, never.
Yeah.
It's never worth it, ever.
Yeah. It's funny because one of my former bosses, who I'm still very good friends with, is a guy who's 15 years older than me. And I always joke around that we're kind of like unlikely animal friends, because he's very introverted and just kind of more walled off in general. And then clearly I'm me. So there's like a much different energy between us. But he and I got really close. And one of the things that he said to me, really as a mentor, was care as much as you need to care. You're somebody who takes pride in your work. Don't give up on your pride in your work. Don't compromise your work ethic or your integrity. But don't care so much that like you can't sleep at night, you're making yourself sick, etc. And I literally just gave that advice to somebody yesterday. I was like, you can't. First of all, you can't do everything. There are always going to be more priorities than there is time in the day. And so I think part of it is also learning to separate the feeling of the ability to actually have tangible work product equates to my value as an employee, because to make good decisions in business, you also need to be strategic. You also need time to think through problems that you need to solve. And so I think when we really get to the root of all of it, it's like there's this aspect of humanity that we have foregone in the interest of driving more value for shareholders, as you pointed out. And it's taking away from our ability to relate to one another in the ways that would ultimately make us more productive.
Absolutely. And I think most, I'll say most companies and most executives, I think, forget that companies are just people. Like I go into a lot of meetings with people, and at the end of it, I look around and go, okay, so who's going to do it? Right? We just spent an hour talking. We love to talk. So guess who's actually going to go do it? It's all the people who are outside of this room who make like at least half of what most of you all do. I'm sitting as a fly on the wall here, but we have to remember that these lofty business goals that are set, I mean,
arbitrarily a lot of the times, let's just call that what it is.
Yes. And I go, you know who's going to get you there? Everybody who's, as you said in the levels, is probably the distribution is much lower towards like 4 and down.
Mm-hmm.
And if those people don't like how they're being treated, they'll just leave. And then all of these goals that we had, you could just crumple them up and throw them away because they'll never happen. And we just fail to realize that. And then when someone has a personal situation, it's like, oh, results first, or, we've got to make sure we hit our deadlines, or this, that, and the other. It's like, well, what happens if that person just goes, I'm actually just not going to come back? Like, then what? What are you going to do then?
Yeah.
People have so much more power and influence on their teams than they realize. And I love to tell them that, because I go, if you're not being treated well, what would happen if you just didn't show up tomorrow or the next day? Like, what would they do? What would they do with all the work that you've been doing? I think things would probably often grind to a halt, or at least be hyper inconvenient. And people don't really realize that. They're like, oh, it's just little old me at my cube. And I'm like, no, you're so much more than that. You have no idea.
Yeah, well, and I think that also reflects the fact that we see ourselves as disposable to these businesses. And because we know that they'll replace us, or they won't. And then the other people are screwed, which is a whole other level of chaos when something doesn't get backfilled. But in this scenario, to your point, if they do backfill a role because somebody's like, I'm done, I'm not coming back, it is time to find that person, hire that person, like go through all the interview processes, hire them, get them ramped up, have them meet, where finally try to get to where you were, which still they won't be. And it's like, so yeah, they might ultimately be a better employee. Maybe they're even a better fit for the company. But the point is that the only way that you can find your path forward is to acknowledge the things that make you uncomfortable and be willing to change your circumstance too. Because I think on the flip side of it, as managers and leaders, it's so important to acknowledge that we're also part of it, right? We have somebody else that we're reporting to, and that we're trying to kind of manage everything around us and still have those needs met. And so I'm curious, as we're kind of rounding out the conversation here, I mean, I could easily have another 3 of these with you. This is clearly a topic that I'm passionate about, but what do you feel is one of the challenges that leaders face that can kind of be disruptive to what you need, in your life? And how do you help regulate yourself or get back to a healthy place if you feel overwhelmed by what you're dealing with?
As a leader myself?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The biggest hurdle for me as a leader is that you're constantly giving pieces of yourself away. So all day long, when you serve someone, which is really what being a great leader is, it's very draining. And so I'll find myself more often than I'd like to admit, where I'm just kind of out of it at the end of the day. And I end up not really being a great husband to my wife because I've just given parts of my self to other people and helping them for the whole day. That at the end of the day, I'm just like, whew, like I can't deal. Like I'm done. And it's really hard to, it's all about boundaries, really. It's about boundaries because I think if you really, really want to be a good leader and you really practice the things that will want people to follow you, you'll see that you start to treat them almost like a family member. And I think that's why leadership gets compared to parenting so much. And I think it's not disrespectful, but it's the fact that you have this unconditional caring for someone and you want what's best for them. It's much like a good parent, at least. And when you're doing that for 8 hours a day, it can be hard to leave that at work. And it can be hard to recognize, okay, I want what's best for you, but I can't do it for you. I can't, you might have technical inefficiencies that I can't help you with, that maybe you're not qualified, honestly, for this job. And it's very hard to separate. We've talked a lot about how people are companies, but then to round it out, you do have to come back and separate it and go, that is work. That is my job to go to work, to be a manager, to be a leader. But when I'm away from work, I have to let that go. I have to let that be. And as a leader, to me, that's by far the hardest thing. If you've really attempted to support those people on your team, it can be very draining.
Yeah. I can totally understand and respect that. I see that in managers and leaders that I've had. And I feel like it's important to acknowledge how valuable that commitment to a team is, to be able to, walk away and still have that caring. Of course, we don't want people like you or my boss to walk away and feel stressed or drained by it. I think that's human nature. It's a lot of stimulation throughout the day, and emotional drain happens naturally. But I think it's important to know and to acknowledge that, as the people who are working for someone like yourself or someone like my boss, that when we walk away from a good conversation, feeling empowered, feeling, like we have the confidence that exists within us, but we can actually express that finally, that we're not sort of stuck in our own heads or feeling like failures after years of being told you're not doing enough, fast enough, hard enough, all of it, right? Is that can shift somebody's perspective massively. And that has such a more profound ripple effect than any amount of, aggressive pressure from bosses or external pressure from clients, whatever it might be. And so I understand, empathize, and appreciate where you're coming from with that feeling of being drained and needing time for yourself to recuperate and to really just, be at peace and settle, right? Because you're just in a heightened state. But I also really, really think that the thing that you might not see unless you have people that acknowledge it to you is how critical and profound that impact is when it's done well.
Yeah, I think most people don't recognize how large their wake is. And I think definitely most managers and leaders and executives don't realize, when you interact with someone, there's that direct impact, right? If I talk to you and you're going to absorb whatever I say, but there's also the indirect impact of if someone sees that from the outside, or you go on after that conversation and have another conversation with someone else, that is like an indirect impact. And our wake is so much bigger, and you don't really get to turn it off. You don't get to go at work like, time out. I just want to be kind of a turd for a minute and I want to shout some things out, and I'm going to treat you like garbage, but then we're going to go back to me being a good leader. You don't get to do that. And you're always on. And so the wake that you have and the impact that you can make in other people's lives is tremendous. And so when you do become a good leader, it's important to remember that you're always one. Like a good coach, I still call my coach as coach. Like if I saw them in real life, I'd say, hey, coach, right? They still have an impact on me. And we have that same impact on people at work. We just don't really realize it.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way to wrap this conversation, Joe. It has been such a pleasure. I really hope to continue the conversation with you and to help spread your message as much as I can. In the meantime, listeners, if you enjoyed this conversation, which I'm pretty sure you must have, you can visit joereichert.live and learn more about what Joe's doing and check out his speaking engagements or reach out to him on LinkedIn. And Joe, is there anywhere else you'd like people to follow you?
Yeah, well, soon there'll be a book called Leader Relativity where I dive into all of this. And it is exactly like if you spoke to me in real life. So reader, be warned. If you enjoyed this, you will like the book. And I think anyone who's interested in a career in leadership or leading other people, this is designed to be like a basic primer. Because I remember when I started, it was frightening and I just wanted someone to help. So that's what it's designed to be.
Incredible. And I'm hoping that you're going to do an audiobook because I feel like that's really dotting the I when it comes to the conversation. You're a great speaker. The other thing that all of you should check out, and I'll put it in the show notes, is Joe's TED Talk about leadership. It was really incredible. He covers some of the topics that we discussed here, but also just really entertaining to watch and to listen to. So thank you so much for your time, Joe. It's just been absolutely wonderful, and I can't wait to chat again.
Oh, thank you so much, Nikki. It was a pleasure.
Well, gang, that's all for this episode of Who the Fuck. We'll catch you on the flip side. Thanks for listening to Who the Fuck. And if you like what you hear, share the show with your friends, family, coworkers, or anyone else you think needs a healthy dose of introspection and raw authenticity. Feel free to rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. It's always appreciated. And you can also visit whothefck.com to check out more content. Plus, you can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at whothefck_pod to keep up to date with what's new in my world and for exclusive bonus content. Catch you on the flip side.